Hello, everybody. Stephen Mead here with Domicile Real Estate. Real estate for people who love houses. This is our Southern California housing market update for October 27th, 2020. And of course, for us, Southern California, we do base our statistics on Los Angeles and Orange counties. Anyhow, this is kind of a really interesting update because I think, one of the things that happens when you study the data like this and you look at the markets is just when you think you've got it figured out, you get thrown a little bit of a curveball and the numbers kind of change on you. And you go back through and you're wondering if we're seeing something that's unexpected. Is it because we've made a mistake in the data? Is it because the market has suddenly shifted? What's going on? I put in here in the title, does it feel like things have changed and gone crazy in the last week? And I will tell you, as an agent working on the field, it absolutely does feel that way. And looking at the data this week, we can kind of see why. And we have a couple pieces of data that are a little bit unusual. And I think it's important to talk about a couple things that have really kind of happened in the last 7 days or so that might be kind of shaping some of these unusual numbers. So I don't want to spoil the surprises for you too much. We're going to jump in and kind of go through our explanations. And yeah, this is what's happening this week. Let's bring on our screen share here. So our first thing that we talk about is our new listings. And most of you who listen to this podcast know that I am big about talking about supply and demand. This is really fundamentally how our market works. And new listings is the supply side. How many new listings are coming up? And one of the things that you notice if you take a look here, and again, we've divided this, as is our custom, in both under 1 million and $1 to $2 million strategies. And if you look here, you'll see that this number is really kind of held fairly steady. If we look at the number of new listings and our under 1 million, this is not that different than through our summer. And if we come down here in our 1 to 2 million, the same thing. It's really a pretty constant number. We've had a very steady supply. Now, what's really interesting about this is that normally in the fall, this number goes down. Like we actually start to see this. We have a crest here and we start to see the slope head towards December. And that really has not happened the way it normally does. I think what kind of illustrates this point a little bit into that this year is very different than previous years is when we compare it to 2019. And if you can see, we have a healthy number. I mean, we're almost at 1,900 new listings this week in under 1 million category versus 1,641 in the same week last year. It's not a holiday week, really. It's not anything unusual. It's just showing that our market is quite a bit more active. Okay, so that's our supply side of the equation. Now let's take a look at demand. And demand is the number of new escrows. So this is the number of properties that went into escrow in the last week. And if we look here in our under $1 million category, we have actually hit a new high. Look at this jump that has occurred, right? I mean, this isn't, we were seeing kind of a trend, kind of leveling, heading downward, and boom, a bunch of properties went into escrow. And even if we look back here in our $1 to $2 million category, we kind of see the same thing. Now, there's really two things that happened last week that I want to talk about. One of those things is sort of a repeatable thing that happens. Actually, both of them are repeatable to some degree. So really, two things have happened in the last week that sort of explain this. The first off is with talks of a potential second round of stimulus, that resulted in rates taking a momentary jump for a few days. And one of the things that we've learned, if you look at markets in the past, is that whenever rates are low and they start to tick up, people panic, right? Because their buying power is immediately reduced. So they panic and try to get into escrow on something. That's kind of a bit of a one-time thing, right? Like that's not something you count on happening every single week. In this market, I do think this will happen again. Now that it looks like there will be no new level of stimulus, rates have eased back down a little bit. And we're talking about even small movements, right, in rates, but people are afraid, is this the beginning of the end of low rates? Have they missed their chance? And when buyers feel that way, they sort of panic and buy anything they possibly can. The second thing that happened in this past week is something that we've talked about in prior weeks, and it's really important to sort of understand the cadence of listings coming on the market and then going into escrow, especially when you are in a supply constrained market, which is what we are in, meaning there are more buyers out there than there are viable houses available to them. And I'm using that term very carefully, viable houses, right? And viable houses are generally the top 75% of listings. So if you have more buyers out there, that means you're kind of always in the situation where buyers are looking for the new listings coming up on the market. So the other thing that happened, right, is if you went back to last week, one of the things that happens, we actually had a little bit of a spike in new homes going up. And if you think about that for a second, right, last week's new listings are this week's new escrows. So I think that's contributing to that rise in new escrows as well. Let's take a look at our absorption rate, which, as you might imagine, has also changed significantly. So if we are now looking at demand, and we were back here, if we were back here looking at supply, and we're looking at demand, the reconciliation of that is our absorption rate. This is sort of reconciling supply and demand. And as you can see, that took a spike here. This is over 90% for our under 1 million category. That means for every 10 houses that came on the market, 90% of that number went under contract in the past week. This is sort of an extreme seller's market. Anything that's 90% above is hyper competitive, tons of bids, people agreeing to, crazy terms, doing whatever to get their foot in the door. What I find fascinating is not that we saw this in the low end, right? The low end, if interest rates go up, people's affordability gets scrunched, right? If you were looking for a $650,000 house and rates jump, you're now looking for a $600,000 house or a $620,000 house. That can cause a big effect, right? And play with demand at the low end. What fascinates me is look what happened here on the high end in our $1 to $2 million. It shot up as well, indicating that maybe a lot of this effect isn't just that sort of one-time interest rate effect, but sort of more of the effect that we're so inventory constrained that as soon as we get any new fresh meat, the number of listings kind of jumps up as people rush to absorb them. So kind of an interesting effect to look at there. Now, if we look at our average pending list price, we see that took a little bit of a hit, not a big one, but a small hit and dove down a little bit. It's really just hovering in this range. I think we're in a bit of a bizarre situation where sellers really don't know how to price houses. And I don't think the agents do either. And part of that's because this sort of demand cycle seems to change week to week. I think a lot of agents are kind of practicing that traditional fall sort of idea that, fall is not the time to test a new price in the market. And I think that's why we're seeing this pending price. There's another effect happening that I want to talk about. That is, when we see inventory be severely constrained like this, there's an interesting thing that happens with buyers when buyers get desperate, right? What happens when buyers are desperate? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, they're willing to pay more for the same house because they're panicked about getting something. Two, they tend to agree to terms maybe that they would never agree to. But the third effect is probably the most interesting one, and that is they loosen their standards. So the buyer who might have said, no way to a fixer, or I definitely have to have a house with a pool, in sort of a more desperate scenario, that buyer starts to say, well, if the house is really nice otherwise, even though it doesn't have a pool, I'll take it. Or if it is a pool house and I didn't want a fixer, but this is what it's going to take to get a fixer, you see buyers loosening their standards. And what that means is that buyers also tend to go after the lower priced homes, the homes that maybe have been sitting on the market. They tend to gobble up that inventory, whereas last week they wouldn't have touched that. They would have just said, does not meet my standards. It is not a nice enough house to meet my needs. So it's interesting to see how buyers behave differently when they feel like their opportunity might be closing. So if you're a seller in this market, now is the time you can be more aggressive with your list prices based on this past week. But I say this with a word of caution. That is where we are this week. I don't know where we will be next week or 2 weeks from now, right? It could be different. So just bear that in mind. And, kind of getting back to this might explain why our pending price is not necessarily increasing, even though our actual aggressiveness of the market may be going up. Now, if we look at our list to close ratio, remember, this looks back at where were the list prices of the homes that closed this week. But you have to remember, that means this data is 30 days old. It is based on the homes that closed this past week or the contracts that were signed 30 to 45 days ago. So we're still hovering above 100%. That means we are in a very strong market. I don't see that changing anytime soon. If we look at our pending list price for the high end, we see that it took a dive. And I think what we might be seeing here is that effect of people loosening their standards. When they think they might get priced out of a market, they suddenly want to lock in whatever home they can lock in. And oftentimes that means going after homes that previously they had said no to. And if we kind of follow along that really explains this graph too. One of the things I've talked about several times on here is that you look at multiple data points that talk about the same thing. And the reason why you do that is because it gives you a reality check on your data. So for example, if you are looking and our absorption rate goes through the roof, which is what happened this week, but you see days on market went up too, that should give anyone who's looking at that data pause and think, what is the reason for that? What's going on? And if you look at our graph, that is exactly what did happen. And to show that it's not just sort of like a blip on the radar, it happened in both price ranges. Look, our days on market shot up a few days here, and it shot up a bunch of days here on our higher end. So what's happening? Why if we're in a super hot market, is days on market going up for new escrows? Well, there's actually a pretty reasonable explanation. We just went over it. So if you think that buyers are getting desperate, and that means they are going back to houses that maybe they said no to 2 or 3 weeks ago, guess which houses are the ones that have been sitting on the market longer, right? It's those ones that, those are the houses. It's the one that's been 30 days in the market that they're going back to because it's overlooked and they think they might be able to get it. And I think because we're seeing that in both these price categories, I have a high amount of confidence that that is exactly what is happening here. We are seeing buyers who maybe are getting a little bit panicked this week. Interest rates took a blip. Inventory has not been catching up. The buyers, I think there's a lot of buyers out there who have realized that low interest rates will not last forever and they need to take advantage of this opportunity. Now, if we go on and we look at our affordability, that tells a similar story. So as a reminder, this is our payment on a median priced home for Orange County homes. So that's single families and condos. And we looked at June of 2018 as our baseline number. We call that 100%. And if you look this past week, things shot up. And what drove this number? It actually was not interest rates. The thing that drove this number is an increase in median price. Median prices are rising. I think you have this effect where buyers feel like they might get locked out of the market. And they are willing to look at almost any and every house. So if you have a hard to sell home, now is the time to sell that house and put it on the market because the buyers will be the most forgiving in that sort of a scenario. And if you're a buyer, well, guess what? That's exactly what's happening, right? Is that there is I think there's been a realization that there's a finite window of time where you'll be able to have these low interest rates and see your purchasing power go really far. I don't really see any upside to buyers waiting at this point. I think even if prices were to decline slightly, it would be more than offset by interest rate increases, and you would afford less house than you can afford today. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching. We also do another video and market update. It is just for first-time homebuyers. That shows up on Friday. So please do like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we love to read and respond to your comments. Anyhow, we will see you next week. I am Stephen Mead for Domicile Real Estate for people who love houses. We'll see you next week.